If God is even possible, must he be necessary? Tonight, we are going to test it. Hang with me.
Coming from the wild, from the rain and the stone, where the wind has no name and the traveler's alone. There's warmth in the fire and truth in the tale of the watcher who walks where the bold-hearted fail. He carries no sword, yet the darkness gives way to the lantern he lifts at the end of the day. He stands on the watchtower, still and unswayed, where the lost find a path through the fog and the fray. Pilgrim gray, oh steward of the lands, you carry the light in your weather-worn hands. A tale at the hearth, a guide through the night. You open the gate between the wrong and the right.
Yes, sir, through the wrong and the right. So tonight, as I mentioned in past episodes, we are going to talk about some evidences for God's existence. And not just any God, but the Christian God. And first, I want to cover what is known as the ontological argument. I've called this episode On the Edge of Reason and Revelation, the ontological argument in knowing God. So, the way I view this, the road winds through doubt as much as through faith here at Pilgrim's Great Chronicles. Robert Clark, your host, because I should introduce the show properly. Yet both lead to the same door. And like I said, tonight we walk the edge of reason and revelation to ask not merely what we believe, but why. So these words set the stage for our journey. Imagine yourself as a wanderer at dusk, lantern in hand, approaching a door at the end of a long road. On one side of the road lies the landscape of questions and skepticism, and on the other side of the terrain, it is faith and conviction, and our path runs right along the ridge between them. We must balance carefully, for a misstep to either side can leave us either in blind faith or in barren doubt. Like a scene from Tolkien's epics, our journey tonight will have the feel of a mythic quest of sorts. I hope that makes sense. Not through Middle Earth, of course, but through ideas. We seek a treasure more precious than gold, right? A reasoned understanding of our hope. And on this, we will face riddles and challenges along the way, but also light to guide us. And by the end of the road, we will arrive at that door, the threshold of knowledge and faith, and find it leads to the same destination from both sides. In this journey, we will discover that the God who is the God who can be known. And that knowing why we believe makes the flame of faith burn brighter, even in the darkest night. So, that is the purpose for the show tonight. And I hope you will find it powerful as a way for you to be able to witness in ways that you have not been able to do before. So, before we delve into philosophical arguments, let's address the why this journey of the mind matters. In the New Testament, the Apostle Peter gives Christians, that's all of us, a clear charge. Always be ready to give a reason for the hope that lies within you. That's in 1 Peter 3:15. So this is the heartbeat of Christian apologetics, not the art of apologizing, all right? That's not what the term means, but of giving an apologia, or a reasoned, logical, thought-out defense for our belief, or explanation for it if you don't like defense, because some people bristle at that expression. But the point is, you have a solid foundation that you can explain for why you believe what you believe. And in today's world, believers face a crisis of knowledge. It's not that faith has lost its meaning is that many modern Christians they have not been taught why their faith is true. They might sincerely believe in God, but when pressed by tough questions or scientific skepticism or even their own doubts or some sort of horrible trial, they struggle to articulate a convincing answer to themselves or others. So Peter's exhortation reminds us that faith shouldn't be a blind leap in the dark, right? I mean, as far as God's concerned, it's just taken for granted that he exists, and you are a fool to believe that he doesn't. But uh, we've all been fools before, so it's important for us to know these things. And faith should have its eyes wide open, and we are called to marry faith with understanding, right? So notice that Peter doesn't say be ready to win every debate. He says be ready to give a reason. And apologetics isn't about scoring points or humiliating skeptics, right? It's about clarity of conviction. It's about loving God, not only with our hearts, but with our minds also, right? Luke 10:27. So when we care enough to seek answers, we show love for the truth and respect for the questioner. And a well-reasoned faith is a sturdy faith, right? Why? Because faith without understanding is fragile. A few weeks ago, I told you about a person who basically stopped believing in God because he got a flat tire on the way to church. So, a belief held only because one's parents or community believed it may crumble under pressure. But a belief embraced because truth compels you to believe will stand firm. So, in an age where many want spirituality without truth, a comfortable, feel-good spirituality that never demands intellectual accountability, Christians are called to something greater, right? Heart and mind. And we are called to worship God in spirit and truth, right? So being prepared with reasons also changes the way we engage the world. Instead of reacting in fear or anger to tough questions because you don't know the answer, we can welcome them, right? Because you're prepared. And we become people who listen thoughtfully and respond graciously. Although I don't always respond graciously. I feel like I'm getting old, and well, I am getting old. I don't just feel like I'm getting old. And I know we're supposed to do this with gentleness and respect, right? As Peter finishes in that verse there. And so God forgive me for the times where I can come across like that old man in the rocking chair on the porch, get out of my yard. What was that movie with Clint Eastwood? Named after a car, I think. It's escaping me because I got too much on my mind. But anyway, I think you all know what movie I'm talking about, where he was a bit on the grumpy side, but still loving. So anyway, this not only persuades others, but also fortifies us. So when you have wrestled with doubts and worked through reasons, your faith becomes immovable. Not because you're stubbornly refusing to think, but because you have thought it through, right? It's so annoying when people just assume that because you don't agree with him, you either haven't thought it through like they have, or you've not read your Bible, or so on. Just deal with the info. Don't assume that somebody hasn't read the Bible or whatever. Although I often uncharitably will jump on somebody who says something in a comment section where I can tell it's clear they did not listen to any of the video. I have this weak spot, I guess. When you take the time and effort, and anybody who's a fellow podcaster who might be listening to this would probably agree, you take great pain and effort to research, write out, put things into logical sequence and segment for you to follow on your list, in your notes and so on, and you're speaking from the heart, and it takes time to prepare and record video and money. These microphones here like this are not inexpensive. Neither is the 4K camera or my monitors and these things that I also use for my studio work. But my point is, there's effort that goes into this. So when somebody just sees the title of a video and comments based off the title, and it's clear they haven't watched the video, that is just like fingers on a chalkboard to me. So it's likely to elicit a less than patient response from me. I try to be, but I'm human. So the Christian who understands why they believe is like a tree with deep roots, right? Like a mustard seed tree. The winds of skepticism may blow, but the tree stands firm. So, with this foundation laid, we turn now to one of the most fascinating and profound reasons for belief in God ever proposed, the ontological argument. Um, I didn't used to think so about this argument, but I have grown to love it. So, it's one of the most elegant and often bewildering arguments for God's existence. Um, The name comes from ontology, of course, the study of being. And unlike arguments that look at the universe, like cosmological arguments, or design in nature, like the teleological arguments, the ontological argument starts entirely in here, your mind. It's a deductive a priori argument, which just means it uses pure reason and ideas, right? The Logos was with God and was God in the beginning. Logic, Logos, the word. Not observations of the physical world, though we can and probably will do that in the future. In essence, it tries to show that if we properly understand what we mean by God, then we must conclude that God exists. So, I know that sounds bold and probably absurd to some, especially people who don't believe in God. And it maybe even sounds like a magic trick, but think of the greatest being imaginable, and poof, he exists, right? Understandably, to say something like that makes people go, "You're full of crap." So let's break it down in simple terms and trace it from its origins. The argument has appeared in different forms over the centuries, but we'll start with a story to illustrate the core idea. I like using analogies. So, just imagine in your mind a perfect circle, not the band led by the Tool lead singer Maynard Keenan, but an actual perfectly drawn circle. You might picture it, but if you try to draw a perfect circle by hand, you'll find it's impossible to get it absolutely exact. No matter how carefully you draw, under a microscope, the line would wobble. But the idea of a perfect circle exists clearly in your mind. Now, philosophers like Plato would say the perfect circle is a real ideal or a form that exists beyond the physical. And so now just extend this idea to a perfect being, the greatest conceivable being. And we can conceive in our minds of a being of, say, maximal greatness, one who has no limitations except for logical coherence, of course. One who is all powerful, and I'll get to what that means later. One is all powerful, all knowing, and morally perfect. This being, by definition, would be greater than any other being we can imagine. And if you imagine a greater one, then that one, the one you thought about previously, can no longer be that, right? I think I must have forgot to turn off my hand signals on my camera because it keeps going wacky. I'll try to move my hands less. So now ask, would existence be a quality that adds to that greatness? Common sense says yes, right? That was my immediate thought. Was it yours? Because a being that exists in reality is greater than a being that exists only in your imagination. If someone offers you, let's say, an imaginary $1,000 versus a real 1,000, I think you would have to admit which one is better, right? So, if the greatest conceivable being exists only in our mind, we can imagine something greater, namely that same being you're imagining also existing outside of your mind. But that contradicts the claim that it was the greatest conceivable being to begin with. And so, therefore, the greatest conceivable being must exist in reality, not just in the mind. And that, sort of in a nutshell, is what we call God. Now, this line of reasoning was first laid out by Saint Anselm of Canterbury in 1078. Anselm famously defined God as, quote, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, unquote. So using the logic we just walked through, Anselm argued that this greatest possible being cannot exist merely as an idea. It has to or must exist in reality. A few centuries later, René Descartes offered a similar argument. Descartes said, in effect, quote, I have the idea of a supremely perfect being. Existence is a perfection. Therefore, a supremely perfect being must have existence, unquote. So these early versions of the ontological argument share a common strategy. They deduce, just like Sherlock Holmes looks at the evidence philosophically and deduces God's existence from the very definition of what it would mean to be God. And to put it in a conversational way, we would say, if by God we mean the greatest possible being, then of course God exists because a God who exists is greater than a God who does not. Or, as one modern summary states, if it's even possible that the greatest conceivable being exists, then by definition, he must exist. And that might strike you as strange reasoning. Can we define something into existence? Critics early on certainly thought something fishy was going on, right? And we'll address those objections. I go through 5 of the biggest ones later on. But let's get this definition down and what this argument is and what it means. So notice that the argument isn't saying we can define just anything into existence, right? It hinges on a very special concept, a being that would be impossible to be greater than. It attempts to show a contradiction in the very thought that such a being does not exist. So let's use another simple analogy. Think of the highest possible number. Are you thinking of one? Okay. I hear kids use them all the time, like a gajillion or whatever. So, well, there is no highest number. No matter what big number you think of, you can always add 1 and get a higher number, right? Because numbers are potentially infinite. There is no upper limit. But now think of qualities like knowledge or power. Is there an upper limit to knowledge? It would seem so, right? Yes. Knowing everything or omniscience would be a maximum, right? You could know everything. You can't know more than all truths, right? So is there a highest degree of power? Yes. Being able to do everything that is logically possible, or omnipotence, is a maximum. You can't have more power than that. How about moral goodness? Maximum goodness would mean never sinning, never doing wrong, moral perfection. So these qualities do seem to have some sort of built-in or intrinsic maximum. So a being that possesses all of these in the highest degree, all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect, would be the greatest in excellence. Now, add one more quality, existence in reality, the real world, and in all possible realities, which is just a fancy way of saying necessary existence, which we'll explain in just a moment. If such a being is even possible, then nothing equal or greater could rule it out of existence. It would have to exist by its very nature. Do you see what I'm saying? I hope so. If not, we'll try to make it more simple here. So this modern formulation of the argument focuses on possible existence and necessary existence. It was refined by philosophers like Gottfried Leibniz and in the 20th century by Alvin Plantinga. Plantinga's version is often called the modal ontological argument because it uses the language of modal logic, or the logic of possibility and necessity. While that sounds technical, we can break it down step by step. In fact, Christian philosopher Dr. William Lane Craig often presents Plantinga's version in debates and writings, and it goes like this. This is Plantinga's ontological argument, and it's 6 steps. 1, it is possible that a maximally greatest being exists. 2, if it is possible that a maximally greatest being exists, then a maximally greatest being exists in some possible world. 3. If a maximally greatest being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4. If a maximally greatest being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world, the world we're living in. 5. If a maximally greatest being exists in the actual world, then a maximally greatest being exists in our reality. 6. Therefore, a maximally greatest being exists. So, you might be thinking, gosh, that's a lot of steps. But you have to make each one, and there's reasons why. But just take a moment to absorb those steps. They sound like they just make your head swim, right? But each has a rationale for it. So let's clarify the terms first. A possible world, right, in philosophy doesn't necessarily mean another planet or universe. It simply means a complete way things could have been. It's like a full description of reality with some variation in it. Like if something exists in some possible world, it means it could have been the case. For example, there's a possible world where you had oatmeal instead of eggs for breakfast this morning, right? It didn't happen in the actual world, but it could have. So it's possible. You see what I'm saying? So think of possible worlds as hypothetical scenarios or complete histories. And now, what is a maximally greatest being, or MGB? Plantinga defines it as a being that is maximally excellent in every possible world. Right? Maximally excellent means having the greatest form of excellencies. Omnipotence, right? Being all-powerful. Omniscient, and being all-knowing. And moral perfection in a given world, right? But to be maximally great, the being must have those qualities in every possible world, not just some of them. So in other words, a maximally great being cannot fail to exist or lack power or knowledge in any conceivable situation, or it's not the greatest. It would have to exist in all realities and possess total power, knowledge, and goodness in all of those realities, which is why it exists in our current real reality, because we are one of those possible worlds that actually exists. So this notion includes what philosophers call necessary existence. So if something exists in every possible world, we say that it exists necessarily, right? Now, by contrast, we exist only in some possible worlds. There are possible scenarios in which you or myself might not have been born, right? So you and I would be considered what are called contingent beings. Our existence is not necessary. And we have to make a difference between the two, and you'll see why in a minute. So the argument's logic from steps 2 through 6 essentially unpacks what it means for a being to be necessary. Those are the logical steps. So if such a being possibly exists, like in premise 1 that we gave earlier, then by definition of necessary existence, it would exist in at least one possible world, premise 2. But if it exists even in one possible scenario, and its existence is necessary, then it must exist in all possible scenarios, including the actual world, which is in premise 3 and 4. And if it exists in the actual world, well, here we are. It exists, premise 5 and 6. In plainer terms, if God's existence is even possible, then God exists necessarily, which means God exists in reality. And conversely, the only way for God not to exist is if God's existence is absolutely impossible, or logically incoherent, as impossible as a square circle or a married bachelor. And I don't think you can prove that that's the case. So at first glance, I suppose this can feel like logical sorcery, but it's a valid deductive argument. The form is such, right? that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true, just like a mathematical equation. So the key question becomes, are the premises true, or at least more plausible than their negations? Specifically, premise 1 carries pretty much the entire weight of the argument, and it says it is possible that a maximally great being exists. All other steps follow from that one, using the definitions of possibility and necessity. In fact, most philosophers agree that premises 2 through 5 are relatively uncontroversial once you grant the definitions. As Dr. William Lane Craig notes, if God's existence is even possible, then the logic of necessary being takes over. And most philosophers would agree that if God's existence is even possible, then he must exist. The logic doesn't falter. It all hangs on whether you think that premise 1 is true. Is it possible at all that such a being exists? Or, equivalently, is the concept of a maximally great being coherent? Or is it somehow like a square circle, a nonsensical combination of words? I think it's completely coherent. So intuitively, right, the idea of a maximally great, all perfect being seems completely coherent. There's nothing obvious about the concept of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, necessarily existing being that contains a contradiction. It's not like a married bachelor, which is directly self-contradictory, right? Think about that for a second. A married bachelor is impossible by definition. The very meanings of married and bachelor conflict, so it's logically incoherent. But a being who is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect, existing in all possible worlds, doesn't present an immediate conflict, like the examples I just gave, of a square circle or a married bachelor. The concept appears perfectly conceivable. It doesn't force us to imagine a logical absurdity, right? Now, that gives us at least a primary first glance reason to say God's existence is possible. And if it's possible, the ontological argument says, then God actually exists logically. It's inescapable, just like 2 + 2 = 4. So at this point, if your head is kind of spinning a little bit, you would not be alone. The ontological argument has always been controversial, even among theists. It's like a high wire act in reasoning, right? A bold move that either soars or crashes. And many objections have been raised, and it's important that we address them, right? After all, our goal is not just to recite an argument here, but to prepare for the questions unbelievers, or even yourself, might have about it. So we're going to walk through some common challenges and see how thinkers like William Lane Craig, Alvin Plantinga, or even an old friend of mine from Facebook that I don't stay in touch with and probably doesn't even remember who I am, Timothy Stratton, responds. I've known him even before he finished Biola University and wrote his book. I think we met when we were both debating the same person about ontology or Molinism, perhaps. I can't remember. Anyway, this way we'll not only have the logical put together argument or modus ponens, the actual argument itself, those 6 steps I gave you, but also be ready with rebuttals when people go, oh, hold on, that's a bunch of crap, right? So I'm going to offer you a kind of modus tollens against the critics, if you will, if you want to call it that. It's just a fancy way of, these philosophical terms to put it in language we can all understand. I'm just giving you arguments against their arguments that are logical, step by step. So one of the first ones you're going to hear, if you're defending the argument step by step, is you're just defining God into existence. Isn't this circular reasoning? So this will almost always be the first reaction because it feels like cheating, right? They'll say, so you define God as a being who must exist and then claim such a being exists. Of course you'll conclude God exists. So this objection was essentially made by one of Anselm's contemporaries, a monk. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. Maybe his first, which looks like it would be pronounced Gaunilo. Anyway, he wrote a rebuttal titled On Behalf of the Fool, in which he offered a parody. He says, imagine the greatest conceivable island, an island than which none greater can be conceived. It has every luxury, perfect climate, etc. And by Anselm's logic, this perfect island must exist, since an island that exists is greater than one that doesn't. Gaunilo's point was that you could plug anything into that argument, right? An island, a pizza, a unicorn. And in our modern universities, they usually use the perfect pizza. People love the pizza or the spaghetti monster and so on. And prove it exists, which suggests something is wrong with the reasoning. But here's the problem. Not all concepts are equal, right? The ontological argument doesn't work for arbitrary things like islands or pizzas because those things don't have intrinsic maximal qualities. Does that make sense? There is no clear greatest possible island. Any island could always be a little bigger or have one more palm tree or an extra slice of pizza with more toppings. Islands or pizzas or most physical objects have no intrinsic maximum. Their greatness is limited and subjective to personal taste, right? In contrast, the concept of a maximally great being involves qualities that do have intrinsic maximums, as we discussed earlier, like omniscience or omnipotence. There's a built-in upper limit to knowing everything or having all power. And the argument for God includes necessary existence. The island example does not. An island is by nature a contingent thing that we discussed earlier, right? Remember the difference, contingent and necessary? It could exist or not exist, and it certainly doesn't exist in all possible worlds, right? There's no reason an island must exist. But God, in the ontological argument, is defined as a being who would exist in all possible worlds if he exists at all. So in other words, Gaunilo's parody fails because an island cannot be maximally great in the way God can. So as one philosopher explains, there is a total difference between a limited particular being like an island and a being whose very essence is to exist without limitation. So modern philosophers point out that great making properties like knowledge, power, and moral goodness are qualitatively different from properties like having a beautiful lagoon or having tasty coconuts on an island, right? So knowledge, power, and goodness each have a natural limit, perfection, right? Whereas an island's features can always be a bit better, and they depend upon the person who's conceiving of the island. So, so defining God as maximally great isn't an arbitrary trick. It's articulating the concept of a God or of God as understood in classical theism. The argument then explores the implications of that concept as long as the concept itself is coherent. We are not illicitly smuggling God's existence into the definition. We're saying if such a thing is possible, it must exist, right? And here's one more angle to look at it. It's true that we start with a definition of God, right? The greatest conceivable being. But a definition by itself proves nothing. It's the logical consequences drawn from it that do the heavy lifting, right? So the argument is essentially a reduction to absurdity, or what they call in Latin a reductio ad absurdum. It assumes the opposite of what it wants to prove. In this case, assume the greatest conceivable being exists only in the mind, not reality, and then shows that assumption leads to a contradiction. So the contradiction is that we end up saying, well, the greatest conceivable being is something greater than which can be conceived. which is nonsense. Therefore, the assumption must be false, and the greatest conceivable being must exist in reality. And that's not circular, it's a legitimate form of proof, right? The key, again, is whether the initial assumption, which is that the greatest conceivable being might not exist in reality, is genuinely contradictory. So the ontological argument says it is, once you unpackage what greatest conceivable being means. So then we have a second most likely response you'll get, which is that existence is not a predicate or perfection you can simply include in a concept. So this is an argument dropped by a famous philosopher named Immanuel Kant. So Kant argued that existence isn't like other properties. You can't say X has the property of existence in the same way you say X is blue or X is tall. Existence, according to Kant, isn't a great making property because saying something exists doesn't add information about the nature of the thing you're describing. It just posits that the concept corresponds to something real. Or in simpler terms, Kant was accusing the ontological argument of treating existence as if it were just another superlative quality. And he said that that's a mistake. A supremely perfect being, Kant argued, might or might not exist, but you don't make it exist by adding, oh, and by the way, it exists to your definition. So, in response, Kant's critique is generally effective against the form of the argument that says existing in reality is greater than existing in the mind alone, right? Which is the original form of the argument before Alvin Plantinga came along and gave his 6. So if one were crudely to say, like, I define God as maximally great, which includes existing, well, it can sound like we're just baking existence into the concept, right? But if you look at the modal version, Plantinga's, that I presented earlier, it doesn't do that in the same way. It focuses on necessary existence as part of God's greatness, not just existence. There's a subtle but important difference. Saying God necessarily exists is not the same as saying God exists as part of the definition. It's saying that if God exists, he would exist by necessity. It could not be otherwise. The argument then hinges on whether such a necessary being is possible. So to clarify it, let's put it this way. The argument does not assume at the start that God exists. It assumes God's existence is possible. So if someone thinks even that is sneaking in too much, we can test it. Is the notion of a necessary maximally great being self-contradictory, like a married bachelor or a square circle? If not, then it's legitimate to consider God's existence being possible. Now, Kant's point that existence is not a predicate reminds us we can't just claim something exists because it would be greater if it did. But in the ontological argument, existence isn't treated as a normal predicate like color or size, right? It emerges as a consequence of possibility plus necessity. Another way to see it, Kant said that you can't define things into reality, and I would agree, but the ontological argument is saying the very concept of God uniquely bridges that gap between idea and reality, if it's coherent. So, in fact, some have argued, like Gottfried Leibniz, among them, that Anselm's argument needed one more step to show that a supremely perfect being is a coherent idea. And Plantinga's version essentially adds that step by focusing on the possibility premise. So once we're sure no contradiction is hiding in the concept, the possibility of God does the work to reach the actuality. I hope that makes sense. So Kant's critique rightly guards us, in a good way, really, against simplistic thinking, but it doesn't refute the carefully formulated modal argument. Even Kant, that's kind of ironic, isn't it? Even Kant couldn't show a contradiction in the concept of God. He just objected to the move of treating existence like a property in a list, like being tall or being blue. Modern defenders responded, necessary existence can be considered a great making property, and it's not quite the same as just saying existence. It's a modal property, or a property about how a being would exist, not an assumption that it exists. And that's the difference. So I think that is a logical defeater of what Kant is trying to imply. And then 3, what if I just say, it's possible God doesn't exist? Couldn't we run a reverse ontological argument that concludes God does not exist, right? I've actually seen this done before. This is an excellent question, and one that philosophers have actually posed, and I've seen it. If premise 1 is the key, then all somebody has to do is hold the opposite, right? It's possible that a maximally great being does not exist, and call that premise 1. Then by similar reasoning, go through the rest and say, basically, it would imply that in every possible world, a maximally great being does not exist. Hence, in the actual world, God does not exist. So in other words, unless you already think God is possible, the argument doesn't convince. Say an atheist could just assert the negative possibility and derive atheism as a conclusion. So it would seem like you would be at an impasse, right? And this is where we have to distinguish epistemic possibility. So for all we know, maybe God exists, maybe not. From metaphysical possibility, what is really possible in reality. So both the original argument and the reverse argument cannot both describe reality because they yield contradictory conclusions. So if one says possibly God exists and another says possibly God doesn't exist, they can both be epistemically true for a person who is unsure, right? You might say, from my limited standpoint, maybe he exists or not. But metaphysically, only one of those can be the actual state of affairs. If God is the sort of being the ontological argument describes, which is a necessary being, then either it's possible he exists, in which case he must, or it's not possible at all, in which case he cannot exist. It's either necessary or impossible. There's no middle ground. Why? Because if a maximally greatest being doesn't exist in some possible world, to be maximally great, it would have to exist in all. So if it fails to exist in one possible world, it fails to exist in any. And conversely, if it exists in one, it must exist in all. So the concepts of necessary existence means God's existence is an all or nothing proposition, either impossible or necessary. So, how do you decide between the all or nothing proposition here? It's either impossible or necessary. So, we just have to sit here and consider which is more plausible. Is there any warrant or reason for thinking a maximally great being is possible, or any reason to think such a being is impossible? So the atheist, to assert their idea confidently, would need to show that the concept of God is completely incoherent or logically contradictory, like the idea of a square circle. And some have tried to argue this, claiming, for instance, that certain divine attributes are incompatible. And I'll get to that in a moment. But as we noted, on analysis, the concept of an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect, necessary, existent being does not appear incoherent at all. Do you think it's incoherent on the level of a married bachelor? Like it doesn't even make sense? I think it doesn't, and William Lane Craig agrees, it doesn't seem even remotely incoherent. On the contrary, it seems intuitively a coherent notion, because it is. If one cannot demonstrate a contradiction in the concept of God, then there's no good reason to say God's existence is impossible. Simply preferring that God does not exist isn't enough. One needs a logical incoherence to point to. Lacking that, the possibility premise stands as reasonable, and therefore we would be justified in choosing the necessary existence of God rather than its impossibility as the more plausible starting point. William Lane Craig offers an analogy, and I think it's pretty good. And he says, think of a very tough mathematical equation on the board. You might say, well, it's possible that equation is true, and possibly it's false, because you personally don't know, right? That's epistemic possibility, because you lack the knowledge of how to do the equation. But in reality, the equation really is either necessarily true or necessarily false, assuming it's a well-defined statement, right? By somebody who can figure it out or has that knowledge. So once you figure it out, you'll know it couldn't have been the other way. And in a similar way, reality itself will be the one way or the other regarding God. If God truly is a necessary being, then either he exists in all worlds or in none of them. We humans might be uncertain, but reality is not ambivalent. So the whole question is, which premise do the arguments and evidence support more? The ontological argument by itself highlights this standoff, but doesn't force the unconvinced to pick. It only says if you grant, right, that if the first premise as plausible, then God's existence follows from it. It's inescapable, just like 2 + 2 equaling 4. And this is why some, like Plantinga's, originally felt the argument, while valid and even sound, might not be a proof that drags the skeptic into belief, kicking and screaming, right? A determined skeptic can simply deny the first premise without contradiction and say, well, I just think the idea of God is like the idea of a square circle, impossible, even if I can't pinpoint why. However, that stance has a cost. It requires faith and a very strong claim that God's existence is impossible. And many atheists won't go so far. They'd rather say, I don't think God exists, but maybe I can't prove it's impossible. The ontological argument gently presses such folks. If you won't say it's impossible that God exists, then you should consider that he does exist. It effectively shifts the burden. And so an atheist must maintain that God is not just actually non-existent, but impossible in principle, which is a much harder claim to defend. And the thing is like the argument says, if the atheist admits that it's even possible, then it's a necessity, and therefore he exists. But anyway, so Craig often suggests combining the ontological argument with other arguments. But I don't have time to present them all here, but I will present other ones. But I just wanted to, present this one for the evening. So for God, anyway, other arguments for God to bolster the plausibility of premise 1. For example, if the cosmological argument from the universe's beginning or contingency suggests there is a cause or necessary being behind the universe, that gives independent reason to suspect God's existence is possible or even likely, right? If the moral argument indicates an all-good lawgiver, which I believe it does, that again dovetails with the God concept, right? Making it logically coherent. These arguments together reinforce, again, the coherence and reality of a maximally great being. And Craig uses the analogy of chainmail armor. Each argument for God is like a link in a mesh, overlapping and supporting each other, rather than a single chain link where if one breaks, the case falls apart. So one might come to premise 1 of the ontological argument already persuaded by other considerations, then a maximally great being could exist, right? And at that point, the ontological argument powers on to conclude that such a being must exist through its logical arguments, its premises. So, objection number 4. Aren't some of God's attributes themselves problematic or contradictory? For instance, can a being really be all powerful and all good given the existence of evil, or omnipotent and omniscient? If God knows everything, including his own future actions, can he have the power to change them? So I personally feel like this is the strongest argument they have against it, to try to make premise 1 logically incoherent. But these are really, I can't spend a whole lot of time in here, but these are deeper philosophical and theological puzzles, right? Crossing into the problem of evil and debates on divine foreknowledge and free will. They aren't direct refutations of the ontological argument's logic, but they aim to show an internal incoherence in the concept of a perfect being. So if any of those challenges were to succeed, it would undermine the very crucial premise 1 by making God's nature incoherent. However, most Christian philosophers believe these can be resolved. For the problem of evil, one can argue that an all-good, all-powerful God could have morally sufficient reasons to permit evil, right? They call this a theodicy. For omniscience versus omnipotence, one can note that knowing what one will do is not a constraint on power. God could do otherwise, but wouldn't choose to go against his own perfect nature or perfect knowledge. Additionally, definitions are important, right? Omnipotence is usually defined as the power to do anything that's logically possible. So God cannot make a square circle, but that's not a real limitation. It's just nonsense. It's logically incoherent. Similarly, God's attributes, properly understood, unchanging, eternal, are not thought to conflict. So these discussions are super numerous and vast, but the upshot is that no widely recognized logical contradiction has been demonstrated in the classical attributes of God. The concept of a being maximally excellent in power, knowledge, and goodness remains coherent as far as we can tell. I don't think anybody's proven an incoherence, and the answers to address the questions that rise from the existence of evil and such things have been dealt with, in my opinion, adequately. So the premise that such a being is possible still stands. And it's worth noting, a historical insight, even a skeptic like David Hume didn't find a logical contradiction in God's nature. Hume's objection was more that we cannot deduce existence by pure thought, and that necessary existence is not a meaningful concept because we can imagine something not existing. But Hume was really questioning whether anything can be logically necessary in existence. So modern modal logic would answer that by formalizing what it means to be necessary, right? Like existing in all possible worlds, and showing, sorry, I got something in my eye here, and showing that it is a consistent concept. So the ontological argument essentially says, if anything fits the bill of necessary existence, it would be the greatest being concept. And since contingent existence, things that come in and out of being, is something we see in the world, the idea that there is a necessary being that grounds all of reality is arguably very plausible. It connects also to contingency arguments. In fact, some have pointed out that when God calls himself I am, it resonates with the idea of necessary existence. But we'll get to that in a moment. And so, number 5, and kind of our last objection here, because I didn't want this show to go too terribly long. I'm trying to keep them within an hour, but this is going to go over an hour. Um, even if, they say, the objectors, even if the ontological argument is logically valid, is it actually persuasive to anyone? It seems you have to already accept the idea of God to find it convincing. Um, I mean, that's a practical objection, I guess. Many people will say, all right, fine. Maybe it isn't illogical, but I just don't buy it. It feels like a word game. And even Alvin Plantinga, who revived this argument, once commented that while he believes the argument is sound, it has true premises and valid reasoning, he doubted it as a successful piece of natural theology, meaning he doubted it would compel belief in someone who didn't already suspect God exists. So Plantinga noted that a person can reject premise one without being irrational. Now, there's no strict logical proof here that forces every honest thinker to assent to the idea. However, he later reflected that expecting such a proof is an unfair standard. Very few philosophical arguments compel assent from everyone because people weigh plausibility. You know, so I would just say this. It's true that the ontological argument doesn't have the same intuitive or empirical appeal as, say, pointing to the universe's beginning or the complexity of DNA or the fine-tuning of the universe. It operates at an abstract level. And so when you present it, like if you were talking to a live audience or friend, you have to do so gently and clearly, acknowledging it's a bit mind-bending, right? So the goal might not be to make a skeptic beat their chest and cry, I now see God exists on the spot. Rather, the goal is often to show that belief in God can rest on rigorous reasoning alone, and that even an argument this abstract has merit. It can plant a seed of doubt in the doubter's mind. The doubt that maybe God's existence isn't as impossible or unreasonable as they thought. And it challenges the assumption that all arguments for God are based on ignorance or gaps in science. Here we have an argument rooted purely in logic and the very concept of God as a maximally greatest being. And that in itself is thought-provoking, right? So the ontological argument can be personally persuasive in a cumulative case like we discussed earlier. Some individuals have found it convincing, especially if they already hold that God's existence is possible, right? They might not believe in God, but they believe it's possible he could exist. And why wouldn't they if they haven't seen a disproof, right? So for a fair-minded seeker, the argument may tip the scale towards belief, right? If I can't rule God out as impossible, then I have to face the real likelihood God exists. So let me sum this one up before we move on. The ontological argument stands strong after centuries of scrutiny. Misunderstandings, like thinking it says, imagine something and make it real, can be cleared up, right? Imparities, like the perfect island, fail because essentially they compare apples and oranges, contingent, limited things versus a necessary, unlimited being, right? And then logical critiques, like Kant's, remind us to be precise. But the modern formulation, like Plantinga's, meets the challenge by focusing on possibility and necessity rather than just asserting existence, right? And the symmetrical, well, maybe not argument only highlights that one must decide if God's concept is coherent or not. And absent a proof of incoherence, to me, the door is completely open for God's reality, right? And therefore he must exist, according to the ontological argument. So in the end, the ontological argument doesn't stand alone as a silver bullet, but to me, it's a great rich part of a full apologetic arsenal. It shows that believing in God can be deeply rational. And it takes one of the skeptic's favorite slogans, right? I only believe in what's logical. And says, okay, fair enough. Let's follow logic all the way. And remarkably, that road of pure reason can lead to God's door, right? So, having reached this point, some might say, well, all right, suppose I grant that a maximally great being exists. How do we know this is the Christian God? Couldn't it be some generic deity or the God of some other religion? How do we get from philosophical theism to Christianity specifically, right? And that's a very important, crucial question. It leads us to the next part of our journey, connecting reason to revelation. So, the ontological argument, like other philosophical arguments, aims to establish theism, the existence of God in general, basically, a creator who is all powerful, all knowing, and perfectly good. So, if the argument succeeds, we've concluded that there is at least one necessary, maximally great being, greater than any other being. But it doesn't by itself tell us God's favorite color, or what texts are inspired, or how God feels about us, and it doesn't specify Christianity as opposed to, say, Judaism or Islam, which also affirm one God who is omnipotent and omniscient. So, how do we identify this being as the God of the Bible, or Yahweh, or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became incarnate in Jesus Christ? Well, first, let's recognize that the God proven by the ontological argument fits remarkably well with the God described in Scripture, right? The argument gives us a being who is eternal, exists in every possible world, hence outside the constraints of any particular time or universe, is omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and the ground of all reality. In the Bible, God says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty, right? An expression of eternal, necessary existence and omnipotence. In the Old Testament, when Moses asked God for his name, God responds, I am who I am, right? And the word Yahweh essentially derives from the expression to be. So this name I am is really profound in this context because it's the ultimate statement of self-existence and self-sufficiency. God depends on no one and nothing. He simply is. And so Christian theologians have long seen in I am an affirmation that God's very essence is existence, exactly what the ontological argument says about a maximally great being. One commentary puts it this way: God is the only one who can say, I am absolutely, meaning his existence is grounded in himself, not given by another. He is not contingent. All other beings have existence as a gift. He has it by his very nature. So this dovetails perfectly with the concept of a necessary being, one who cannot not exist, whose non-existence is impossible, who holds all other beings in contingent existence. So the ontological arguments, God is a being of maximal goodness and love, moral perfection, right? And this aligns with the biblical description, God is love, and the whole narrative of Scripture where God's goodness is fundamental. If a maximally great being exists, it would be worthy of worship by definition, right? Since nothing can be greater or more ultimate. And indeed, the Bible's God is depicted as alone worthy of all praise and worship, right? And so, philosophically, there's no disconnect. The argument gives us a God consistent with Christianity's God. It rules out polytheism, right? There can't be two maximally great beings. They would limit each other's greatness. Greatness implies uniqueness. It also rules out finite deities or impersonal forces, right? A ground of being that isn't all-knowing or isn't God or good wouldn't be maximally great. So we're left with essentially the God of classical monotheism. But how do we go from this abstract concept to the concrete person of Jesus Christ or the specific revelations of the Bible? And here is where Revelation completes our reasoning. Reason can get us to the door of theism, right? Revelation and historical investigation leads us through that door into Christianity. So think of the ontological argument as discovering that there is a door at the end of our road and it's unlocked. It tells us someone is home in the universe, right? Now, revelation is like hearing a voice from inside inviting us in and introducing himself. And the Bible claims to be that voice. For example, in Exodus 3:14, when God says, I am who I am, he's giving Moses not just a proof of existence, but a name, Yahweh, by which he will relate to his people. This name conveys that God is eternal and uncaused. Yes, but it's also deeply personal. So later in the New Testament, Jesus famously echoes this by saying, before Abraham was, I am, identifying himself with that same self-existent Lord. The Logos doctrine in the opening of John's Gospel is particularly fascinating. John 1:1 declares, in the beginning was the Word, or Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The term Logos in Greek means word, but also reason or divine rationality. It's as if John is saying that the ultimate reason behind the universe is God, and that reason became flesh in Jesus. So this directly ties the abstract, right, logic, reason, concept, to the personal Jesus Christ. The very idea of logos would resonate with philosophers of the time, but John shocks them by saying the logos is a person, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. So here, logic and revelation unite. The rational principle upholding everything is also the relational God who enters history. So, from the ontological argument's conclusion, God exists. How do we move to the Christian God is the true God? Well, we examine the claims of various religions about who God is and what God has done. The maximally great being established by natural theology could, in principle, have revealed himself in different ways in history, right? The Christian claim is that God revealed himself supremely in Jesus Christ. Is that claim consistent with our established concept of God, and is it backed by evidence? Well, let's consider this. A maximally great being would be all good and loving. Would perfect love remain completely aloof from his creation? Likely not. Love seeks to communicate and relate, right? As one writer, Dr. Timothy Stratton, put it, a maximally great being would not be aloof or uninterested in his creatures. He would not remain distant or hidden. He would reveal truth about reality, about purpose, and about himself. He would not merely stand outside suffering, but would step into it to redeem it. So this powerful insight suggests that if a God of perfect love and goodness exists, we should expect some kind of self-disclosure and some action in history that demonstrates his character. So in Christianity, we have exactly such a claim, that God, the maximally great being, entered our story. The Jesus of history is not a myth. He's a documented figure who, unlike any other founder of a religion, claimed to be one with God and validated that claim in a dramatic way. The Christian narrative says the Logos, or the maximally great being, became flesh as Jesus, taught with divine authority, sacrificed himself for our sins in the ultimate act of love, and rose from the dead, conquering death. So the resurrection of Jesus is a historical claim that can be investigated. And interestingly, if a maximally great being exists, miracles like a resurrection are not only possible, but highly plausible, because such a being would have power over life and death, and a perfectly loving God might very well choose to overcome death to save his creatures. Stratton notes that if the God of the ontological argument exists, then the resurrection is not only possible, it is in many ways expected. Why expected? Because what better way to show ultimate love and defeat evil than for God to enter the world and take on suffering himself to rescue us, right? It takes on things morally and legally. And it's precisely what Christianity says happened. So now doesn't this prove Christianity is true? Or, I'm sorry, it doesn't necessarily prove Christianity is true. Rather, it shows Christianity to be a natural fit with the God that pure reason has led us to this evening. It takes the next step by offering specific revelations and historical acts of God. We can then marshal evidence for those, the historical reliability of the Gospels, the testimonies of the resurrection, etc., that goes beyond our focus tonight, but it's good to see the continuity. The philosophical God and the biblical God are one and the same. So, as Dr. Craig often says, arguments like the ontological one get you to a core concept of God consistent with Christian monotheism. From there, one considers Jesus, his life, claims, miracles, and resurrection. If he truly rose from the dead, and there's strong evidence he did in the empty tomb and appearances, then that vindicates his claim to be the revelation of God. The ontological argument assures us that believing in an all-perfect being is rational. The resurrection assures us that this being has personally revealed himself and confirmed the truth of Christ's message. So the two together give us a full picture from the rational logos to the incarnate word. To put it poetically, the road of logic leads to a threshold, and on the other side of that door stands Jesus, the Word made flesh, saying, "Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." So the philosophical journey meets the person of Christ. The Apostle John opened his gospel by merging these, right? Essentially saying the Word, or reason, was God, and the Word became flesh. In Christ, the abstract greatness of God becomes concrete and tangible. It's as if the ontological argument became flesh. And this means our belief in Christianity is not a leap that abandons reason at the final step. It's the fulfillment of reason by revelation. So to answer the question, yes, the ontological argument's God is the same God that Christianity worships. We move from knowing that there is a God in general, right, to knowing who God is in particular by looking at God's actions in history and ultimately in Jesus. And the self-existent I am of Exodus is, in Christian understanding, the very one who took on humanity in Jesus. Jesus even used the phrase I am in ways that echoed that divine name, right? And his earliest followers, devout Jews who believe in one God, identified him with Yahweh, calling him Lord. And they did so because of what they witnessed. So his authority over nature, his forgiveness of sins, and supremely, his resurrection from the dead, right? They experienced the maximally great being in the flesh, full of grace and truth. And as one writer concluded after examining the ontological argument alongside Jesus' story, quote, "In short, the MGB of the ontological argument looks remarkably like the Jesus of history," unquote. So, why does that even matter today? Well, we've traveled through some deep waters of thought. And so let's step back and ask, why does all of this matter right now? Well, I think because we live in a time when arguably it's not popular to examine one's faith, right? Many prefer a vague spirituality, a comfortable or a comfort blanket of belief without the skeleton of truth to support it. They don't want to think. People say, believe whatever works for you, right? Implying that faith is a subjective choice, not an objective reality like mathematics. In such an environment, having strong reasons for your faith is revolutionary, and it instills confidence, resilience, and authenticity. So, confidence, because you know your belief is not just a hand-me-down tradition, but a conviction tested by reason, right? You've been using your mind. You can interact with critics or doubters without fear because you've done your homework, right? So when someone asks, well, how can you believe in God in the 21st century? Are you retarded? Well, you can reply and not have to be defensive, but with a thoughtful answer. Well, let's talk about it. Have you considered, for example, the ontological argument or the origin of the universe or the evidence for the resurrection, right? Using a calm, reasoned response can surprise people and open their hearts because most of them expect to be able to intimidate you because they assume you don't have an answer. And then resilience, because as we mentioned, faith with understanding can withstand the storms, right? Imagine two people. So we have one has kind of a secondhand faith. I just believe because I was raised that way, kind of a thing, right? And the other has a personal faith reinforced by reasoning, right? I believe because it's true, and here's why I think it's true, and they can explain it. So when university professors challenge the existence of God, or if some personal tragedy strikes, which faith is more likely to endure and be shown to be real, right? The one that has grappled with questions and found solid ground and answers in an age of science worship, where some claim only science gives truth. A believer who can show that philosophy and science both point toward God will not be easily shaken. So, in fact, many of the greatest scientists were theists and did science because they expected a rational creator behind it all. So, the more you understand that belief in God is intellectually robust, the more boldly you can face the world, right? As one apologist put it, when your belief is rational, tested, and internally consistent, it becomes immovable. I'm pretty sure Tim Stratton said that, but I can't remember. And then we have authenticity, right? Because you'll know that you're believing not out of habit or peer pressure, but out of a genuine conviction, right? Today, a lot of young people abandon the faith of their upbringing, not because they wanted to, but because they really never made it their own, right? They never had any of their questions answered. They had, you know, nobody engaged them in their unanswered questions. So by seeking answers and by asking, why do I believe this? You make the faith yours, right? And by answering others like those teens, you help make their faith their own. It's no longer your parents' faith or your pastor's faith or your wife's faith. It's yours, held with integrity, right? And authenticity is powerful. The world respects someone who has thoughtfully chosen what to believe and can articulate it. So even if they disagree, right, they'll often at least admire your sincerity and effort in answering, right? And on the contrary, if our only answer is to why do you believe, I just have faith. Well, the world hears that as I don't have a reason, I just choose to. It's really better to just say, I'm not certain, I'll go look it up. And there's nothing wrong with faith, right? You should have faith. We should also have answers like the Bible tells you to do. Be able to give a reason for why you believe. That's a good reason. And I feel like that does the gospel a disservice because Christianity is true, and not just true for me, but true for everyone, rooted in reality. And we should not be shy about demonstrating that. And we should look and search and find out why. Why do you have faith, right? If you're going to say, I just have faith, well, why do you? When somebody asks, why do you have faith? Why do you believe what you believe is true? And so, understanding apologetics and arguments like the ontological argument doesn't mean you'll never have any doubts or that faith becomes purely an equation. We are, whole persons, right? We are emotional, spiritual, and relational. And faith involves trust, not just head knowledge, right? This is about a relationship. So it's your heart and your mind, right? Loving God. But the role of reasoning is to remove obstacles to faith and to show that trusting Christ is not a blind leap, but a step in the same direction that the evidence points. So when you know there are good reasons, your heart can rest more easily in what it loves because your mind affirms it also, right? So faith and reason are not enemies. They are dance partners in a way, fellow musicians playing in harmony together. And as the prophet Isaiah records, God's invitation, right? Come, let us reason together. So God is not afraid of our questions. In fact, I think he loves answering them for us in ways we don't expect. And so finally, think of the impact on others, right? If you're talking with other people in your conversations, when you share not just what you believe, but why, you really honor the listener because you're saying, I take your questions seriously. I've asked them to. Here's what I found out, right? And that approach can be the difference between someone dismissing you as a fanatic nut job and someone actually considering, hey, maybe there's something to this. And in doing so, you leave breadcrumbs for them. In the early church, believers were so convinced and winsome in sharing why Christ is Lord, right? Reasoning from the scriptures, that many were persuaded, right? So reasoning from the scriptures and giving solid reasons is part of sharing the gospel. And sometimes apologetics can even be pre-evangelism, right? Like breaking up the soil for the seed of God's word. It tills the soil so the seed of the gospel can take root. And in our skeptical age, it may be more needed than ever, right? Because a lot of the soil is pretty hard. And people have heard slogans like faith is irrational or church is anti-intellectual, right? And when you know why you believe what you believe, then you get to shatter those misconceptions by your example. So just ask yourself, do I believe simply because I feel it or because it's been explained to me? Or do I believe because I'm convinced it is true, because I've looked up answers and I know why I believe what I believe? If every supportive voice around you fell silent, right? No church community, no family encouragement, would your faith have a leg to stand on? So if tomorrow some charismatic celebrity or professor mocked Christianity as a fairy tale, because it happens daily on social media, it happens in my comment section on every social media I have. Would you secretly worry they might be right, or would you smile knowing you have solid reasons they perhaps haven't considered? So the goal here is not pride. You should be humble, knowing we don't know everything. Our goal is assurance. We can have a faith that is humble yet unshakable because it's grounded in truth and love. So there is that. Oh, I forgot my cute little things up here. I should have shared those with you. In fact, I'll share them with you now. How's that? We'll look at this one right here. Oh, see, isn't that lovely? I'll make it full on and we'll replay it. Those are possible world bubbles. I guess I should have looped it for you. Yeah. And then there's this one. We'll just let that go. So at the outset, we painted the image of a road winding through doubt and faith toward a door. But now we stand at that door, having explored reason and having glimpsed revelation. The wanderer's lamp burns brighter, not because the night is darker, but because he knows why he walks, or both. And in other words, when you have purpose and understanding, your light shines even in great darkness. You're not just stumbling, right? Hoping for the best. You should be striding forward, right? Lamp held high, confident in the path. And so I urge you, walk knowing. Don't settle for just saying, I just believe. Dig deeper so you can say, I believe because, and then give your reason. And believe knowing, loving God with all your mind as well as your heart. The greatest adventure for any pilgrim is not only to reach the destination, but to understand the journey, right? Oh, let's play this one. And so we've seen that God, who awaits at the end of all our reasoning, is not a vague force or a distant idea, but the living God who both is and can be known. That's how I feel. Oh, this one had sound to it. Let's block it out. It's a guy walking a path with a lantern. That's pretty cool. All of these Little videos are pretty cool. This is my favorite one, though. All right, so he can be known. He stands at the door and knocks, inviting us into a relationship that satisfies both your mind and your heart. And our journey tonight showed that that what we believe has rich logical support, and why we believe can be articulated with boldness and grace, right? And so now it falls to each of us to carry this light onward. And remember that initial question: if everything external was stripped away, every sermon, every song, every supportive friend, would your faith stand on solid reason or collapse under rhetoric? So after tonight, I hope you feel more equipped to answer that. Strengthen your foundation with both the Word of God, Scripture, and the words of reason that God has given us through gifted thinkers. The two are friends, right? Come and let us reason together. When doubts come, you'll recall arguments like the ontological one and others and say, no, I have seen that my faith is logically and evidentially grounded. I know whom I have believed and why I can believe and trust him. And when you engage with others, you can do so not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence, offering them not just statements to believe, but reasons to believe. So in closing for the night, take heart that truth is on our side. As we part, hold on to this final image, right? That I made a video of. A lone wanderer walks through a moonless night, but his lamp glows steadily. He isn't afraid of the dark because he has light, and he knows the road's end. I'll play it again so you can see it. That wanderer can be you and myself. We walk through a world often dark with confusion and skepticism, but our lamp, the light of Christ, illuminated, right, by reason and revelation, burns brighter, precisely because we know why we walk. We know our destination and the one who awaits us. So just walk knowing, believe knowing, for the God who is the God who can be known, and he has made himself known. And that is our hope, our reason, and our unshakable confidence, right? So I wish Godspeed to all of you. Sorry that my voice gives out on these over hour-long shows. But I hope the rest of the work week for you is a good one. And I'm going to try to get caught up on some answers to Facebook and YouTube. I did a bunch of that earlier in preparing for this particular show. And boy, there are some really, really deep conversations in the comments on some of our videos, especially lately with the Rapture ones on Facebook and on YouTube. So if you get around to watching the video and reading the comments, you'll see where we're coming from. And I hope you find this beneficial, and we may do more apologetics in the future, just depending on whether you find things like this helpful or not, or if you would prefer knowledge on some other things. I had considered doing an episode on the Star of Remphan, because I know Israel's been in the news a lot lately. And I find it very interesting that nobody seems to really know why they call this the Star of David. So, I mean, there are reasons, but none of them seem to be on a solid foundation. So we may go over that maybe next week, unless some of these interviews that I've had lined up wind up being able to make it, because I wind up having to reschedule a lot of them. So we do have upcoming interviews, and I try not to put out there until it's actually been done. So with that being said, have an awesome work week, and we will see you Wednesday.
Gather round, ye travelers, lend me your ear. A tale of heroes who knew no fear. Through shadowed woods and mountains steep, their legacy lives where the wild winds sweep. Raise your soaked breeze, songs as endless as the trees. Raise your 10 cups.